morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of Municon. I'm Lori Larson with the Washington Stormwater Center, and I had the privilege of working with an amazing, dedicated team of municipal staff to plan this conference. I hope you've enjoyed the first 2 days. Take a look at the announcements in the lobby. Today, we're going to acknowledge that amazing team, and it would be great for you all to know who they are. Today, our speaker is Dr. Jennifer McIntyre. She's an associate professor of toxicology, aquatic toxicology at Washington State University and works with the Washington Stormwater Center. Her focus is on science that affects change, and she has a history of affecting change. She is responsible for the ban of a pulp mill effluent used as road dust suppressant. She worked with, her research was used by the Washington Department of Health to issue a fish consumption advisory for Lake Washington. And her legislation in Washington and California was used to phase out copper brake pads. Today, she's going to share her most recent research with us, Where the Rubber Meets the Road, Tire Chemicals in the Toxicology of Stormwater. Jen, please take it away.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Nice and bright and early. Hope this will be a good start to your Municon day. I first want to acknowledge the research partners and funders who've contributed to and supported my research over the years. And today I'll be talking about an issue that I particularly want to make sure to acknowledge the work of Ed Kalaje and his team at the University of Washington, Tacoma, as I'll be featuring that shared work that we published in Science at the end of the year. So I want to start off with sharing the context that we live in a chemical world. In the United States, we have about 83,000 chemicals that are used commercially, and they are regulated under the Toxic Substances Control Act. An additional over 2,000 chemicals are used as pesticides, and they're regulated under FIFRA. And roadway runoff alone contains thousands of unique chemicals, and this is just that number is just coming from looking at a subset of even organic chemicals. So in addition to that, we have all of the metals and the other non-organics. So a very chemical, complicated world that we live in. But that's okay, right? Because we have regulations in place to protect ourselves and aquatic animals from these chemicals. We have the Clean Water Act, which is designed to protect waterways from the discharge of toxic pollutants in toxic amounts. And then we have state water quality standards that are guided by these federal regulations that are designed to provide water quality for the protection and propagation of fish, among other uses. And among these state water quality standards, we have aquatic life criteria. And what these do is designate concentrations of chemicals that are allowed in surface waters without harming aquatic species is the idea behind those. And of course, we regulate stormwater runoff, and we do this because we value healthy ecosystems. That's why we have these regulations in place. The direct benefits to us are clean water, clean food, clean air. And then there are the indirect benefits to us of having healthy food webs as a whole. So how do we regulate stormwater? Well, we use chemistry. We use these rules and regulations about chemical concentrations that are allowed in surface waters. In Washington State, we have aquatic life criteria for about 31 chemicals. And most of these are metals and pesticides. And under the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, we have permits that set numerical limits for a small number of pollutants that are in stormwater runoff, right? I mean, you folks know about this. So my rhetorical question is whether our current stormwater regulations are sufficient to protect aquatic ecosystems. And to highlight this mismatch, I'm going to somewhat briefly summarize a mystery that my research group has recently solved in collaboration with many partners. So the story started about 20 years ago when a group of Seattle area researchers noticed that Coho salmon returning to spawn in urban streams were behaving abnormally after it rained, right? Notably, this was at many of the area creeks, at one of the many area creeks that had had a complete makeover in terms of habitat restoration. The restorations wanted to know, if they rebuilt it, would the fish come? And in fact, they did. And adult salmon were again observed using these systems. But these otherwise healthy looking fish were dead within hours of these abnormal behaviors. Researchers led by NOAA Fisheries and US Fish and Wildlife Service at the time began studying the issue, and they found that the phenomenon was both widespread and is both widespread and recurrent. And the symptomatic fish were displaying a variety of behaviors, including surface swimming, gaping at the surface, disorientation, and a loss of equilibrium. And this led to high rates of mortality that can include the entire run, especially in systems that aren't receiving a lot of spawners. So population modeling subsequently by NOAA Fisheries researchers demonstrated that even modest rates of this pre-spawning mortality would be expected to lead to local extirpations, to local extinctions of populations. So this mortality was not explained by temperature, by dissolved oxygen, by things that we regularly do regulate, by the presence of pathogens or commonly measured toxic chemicals for which we have aquatic life criteria. Although we did find evidence of exposure to common pollutants like metals and hydrocarbons, the concentrations that we measured both in the water and in the tissues did not appear sufficient to explain this mortality. Instead, the weight of evidence pointed towards the influx of stormwater runoff into these systems. And as you know, in developed landscapes, we don't get that infiltration taking place because of the impervious area that's involved. And that runoff picks up and moves with it a lot of chemicals so that by the time it reaches surface waters, it's pretty polluted. So what is it about stormwater that is killing the coho, right? That's the mystery that we have set out to solve, years and years and years ago. After our initial results documenting rates of mortality in about 7 Seattle area creeks, more extensive spawning surveys were conducted to understand how widespread the phenomenon was. So local municipalities, tribal nations, and nonprofit groups all contributed information from more than 50 basins around Puget Sound that enabled this extensive land use analysis by NOAA Fisheries and US Fish and Wildlife Service that allowed them to predict rates of mortality for coho salmon from this phenomenon throughout the Puget Sound region. So that's what this map is. And not surprisingly, the higher rates of predicted mortality are coinciding with the more developed basins, right? Obviously all of the red around Seattle and also Tacoma and even up in Bellingham. So the higher rates of mortality were not more broadly associated with development, though. What was interesting is that the higher rates of mortality were correlated most strongly with roads, with the presence of roads and with busier roads and more dense traffic. So that led us to study, to focus in particular on what roadway runoff. So about 10 years ago, we began to study roadway runoff during rain events. We began to expose aquatic animals directly to this runoff to start to understand what it might be doing to those animals when it entered receiving waters. And we found that by experimentally exposing adult coho salmon to roadway runoff, that we were able to recreate the acute changes in behavior and the pre-spawning mortality that we were seeing in urban creeks. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen these videos already. So through various experiments then, we've seen that this affects not just the adult spawners, but it also affects, experimentally we can see that it affects juvenile coho. They are also sensitive, and also recently hatched alevin. And also that very little runoff is needed to cause this acute mortality. Runoff collected from different storm events produces similar levels of toxicity, and essentially 100% mortality at 25 or greater percent runoff in the experiments we've done, and significant mortality even at just 5% runoff. So coho are somewhat uniquely sensitive to stormwater runoff among Pacific salmon that we have studied, but there is a gradient in sensitivity among these species that we've tested. We found that steelhead and chinook are the next most sensitive species of Pacific salmon, and that sockeye appear unaffected, similar to chum. And I want to point out here that we're talking about really overt toxicity, right? We're talking about rapid onset mortality, really. So even though we've looked at blood parameters in the adult salmon study that we did, in juveniles, we were only looking at mortality. And so it is likely that there are sublethal effects that we need to be concerned about with these other species, and also with coho exposed to sublethal concentrations. All right, so what is it in road runoff that is lethal to coho? This was not an easy question to answer. Urban stormwater runoff is very chemically complex. I mentioned the thousands of unique organic chemicals that Ed Kalaje's postdoc Bowen Du reported on a few years ago. Kathy Peter, another postdoc with Ed Kalaje, started to explore the identity of some of those chemicals and found that even many of the ones that were identifiable were not necessarily toxicologically characterized. We didn't necessarily know what their impacts would be on aquatic organisms. And then finally, the chemicals that we regulate in stormwater don't appear to be causing this observed toxicity. Mixtures that we have made of metals and hydrocarbons, even at higher concentrations than you would find in stormwater runoff, do not elicit these symptoms and do not cause mortality even in these acute short-term exposures. So instead of sorting through all of the chemicals in this crazy soup, we started to study the sources of chemicals to roadway runoff. We know that they're coming from particles. They're coming from particles worn from tires, particles in exhaust, particles coming off of our brake friction materials, and also the fluids that come out of our vehicles, things like windshield washer fluid and all the things that leak out of our vehicles. So we looked at the chemical similarity of these different vehicle sources to comparing that chemical complexity to these waters that we know can kill coho. So samples of roadway runoff and samples of urban receiving waters, urban creek waters during storm events. So among 75 non-target organic chemicals, tire particles of the vehicle sources, tire particles stood out as being most chemically similar to these waters that kill coho. And this means that there's a lot of the same chemicals that are in stormwater or coming off of tire particles dominate that chemical soup of roadway runoff. It does not necessarily mean that would be the source of the toxicant that's killing the coho. So we conducted further experiments to determine the question of whether tires are the source of this acute toxicity to coho. So we know that stormwater, that roadway runoff is acutely lethal to coho, does not appear to affect chum. And when coho gets sick, they show elevated hematocrit, that's the HCT, and reduced concentrations in their plasma of ions and also reduced pH. So through a series of experiments, we showed that each of these was also the case for chemicals that were leaching into water from tire particles. So in fact, yes, the tires did appear to be the source of this acute toxicity to coho salmon. Now, to isolate the responsible toxicant, we paired toxicology exposures with high-resolution mass spectrometry. This was the work, the chemistry was the work done by Ed Kalaje and his team. This analytical technique essentially detects all of the organic chemicals present in a water sample, and it tells you that different chemicals are there. You learn the mass and the retention time of those chemicals, but it does not tell you what the chemicals are, right? That requires additional sleuthing. So we made a tire leachate by recirculating water through particles worn off of the tread of tires. And we did this leaching for 24 hours. And then we fractionated the leachate to reduce its chemical complexity, okay? And so initially we did this by filtering the leachate through sand to remove any particle-bound chemicals. We used chelation to remove metals from the water sample. And then the subsequent steps I'll show you on the next slide. So we exposed Coho to each of these fractions. And so we were using them as a screening tool to track the toxicity. The fraction that killed Coho still contained our unknown toxicant. So then through high resolution mass spec, we tried to identify the chemicals that were present in that fraction. And we also continued to reduce the chemical complexity by further fractionation. So this approach did work. Our initial leachate contained more than 2,000 chemicals over here. And each fractionation step resulted in one toxic and several non-toxic fractions. So that's the red being the toxic fraction that continues on through this sequence. And then the blues not causing toxicity, we didn't continue to study. So through this approach, we were able to sequentially reduce the chemical complexity down to just 4 chemicals, a toxic fraction that contained just 4 chemicals. And this final fraction was dominated by a compound with the formula of C18, H22, and 2O2. And this was present in the leachate at about 30 micrograms per liter. But what was this chemical? NMR later confirmed the structure of the chemical, which I'm showing you here, but we still didn't know what it was. It did not appear to be a known ingredient in tires based on the literature. Zhenyu Tian, who was the lead fractionation mastermind on this project, he made the association between this unknown C18, H22, and 2O2 and the anti-ozonant 6-PPD that is used in tires. It is an ingredient in tires, and it has the same number of carbons and nitrogens, whereas oxygens and hydrogens can change when oxidation and reduction occur with chemicals. So based on this very good hunch, the team purchased industrial grade 6-PPD, just purchased a commercial source from a commercial source. And then through ozonation, they produced a mixture of chemicals, of transformation products from the ozonation that included the unknown chemical, right? So here's the ozonation sequence that in fact did lead to this unknown chemical, which we now call 6-PPD quinone. So subsequent to that, we used toxicology screening again to validate that this was our toxicant and that 6-PPD was the parent compound. So 6-PPD, the first 2 lines of this table, produce little to no acute mortality, whereas the ozonated 6-PPD, that O3 mix, and the purified ozonated 6-PPD, which contains 6-PPD quinone, and then the purified 6-PPD quinone, whether it was purified from that ozonation mix or whether it was purified from our tire leachate, those were acutely lethal. To explore the environmental relevance of the toxicant, we examined mortality curves for dilutions of roadway runoff and tire leachates, this top panel here, on the basis of their quinone concentration. So just looking at the concentration of quinone in those samples, we determined that if that's what's driving the toxicity in these complex mixtures, it's the median lethal concentration for that quinone present in those samples was about 0.8 micrograms per liter. So in panel B, we have the dose-response relationship for just the purified quinone. And the LC50 for the purified quinone was essentially the same. So this suggested that the toxicity of the more complex chemical mixtures of the tire leachate and the roadway runoff, that they could be explained by the concentration of quinone that they contained. So this led us to conclude that in fact 6-PPD quinone is the primary causal toxicant of the acute mortality in Coho. We also showed that 6-PPD quinone is present above lethal concentrations in all roadway runoff samples that we analyzed. Additionally, in 6 out of 7 stream samples from Seattle taken around the timing of mortality events for Coho, we found that the concentration of quinone was near or above that median lethal concentration that we had determined in the lab. And finally, that this quinone was detected in runoff or receiving waters from a variety of locations that were included in the study. And so this encouraged us to conclude that we would expect to find 6-ppd quinone anywhere where there are tires and therefore tire rubber particles. So I want to add a few more pieces about this relationship with the tires. So ground level ozone, which is a ubiquitous air pollutant, particularly where there are combustion engines being used, ozone is continually attacking the surface of tires. So the way that the anti-ozonants work is that they slowly migrate to the tire surface throughout the life of the tire. And then the ozone reacts first with this anti-ozonant rather than with the tire polymers. Without the 6-ppd, in this case, the surface of the tire cracks as ozone and other oxidants break down those tire polymer bonds between tire polymers. When the ozone reacts with 6-ppd, we now know that it's transformed into 6-ppd quinone and a few other chemicals. And in fact, this change is what's responsible for the brown coloration that tires get. And you particularly see that on the sidewall because on the tread, it's continually being worn off, right, by actually driving. And there's all sorts of products on the market to help your brownish tires become shiny and black again, which of course washes off the 6-ppd quinone. Because the point I want to make here is that 6-ppd quinone is already present in the surface of the tire, and that this quinone can leach directly from the tire surface in addition to from those worn particles wherever they may be. All right, so what can we do about this problem? It's clear that simply following existing regulations for protecting aquatic life from chemicals is not sufficient. So what can we do? One solution that we are pursuing is talking with US tire manufacturers about whether there are safer alternatives to that parent compound, to 6-ppd as the anti-ozonant in tires. We've also been talking with groups like Salmon Safe about incentives and marketing opportunities for tires that are in fact salmon safe. So that's a very exciting option for a solution that we're looking forward to, but that solution may take some time. So in the meantime, we already do have a robust set of solutions in our toolbox in green stormwater infrastructure. As you likely know, researchers at the Washington Stormwater Center have been studying various GSI for going on a decade now. And despite not knowing what the responsible chemicals were for the Coho pre-spawn mortality phenomenon, we have shown that bioretention filtration can prevent the acute lethal effect of roadway runoff on Coho salmon. So with support from various organizations and institutions, including the Stormwater Action Monitoring, we have also shown that this is true for adult Coho, in addition to adult Coho, also for juveniles and for alevin. It can also prevent many of the sublethal effects that we have seen in developing fish. And retrospective analysis of the non-target organic chemicals by Ed's group has indicated that 6-ppd quinone is undetectable in the effluent of these experimental bioretention systems that we've worked on together. We haven't done too many, but the ones for which we had these archived samples, we don't see it in the effluent, although it's present in the influent. And we've also worked with Federal Highways and Washington State Department of Transportation on a BMP effectiveness project with compost amended bioswales, which treat runoff adjacent to highways. And again, with using retrospective analysis, we see that 6-ppd quinone was removed at very high rates from the roadway runoff that was being treated by these bioswale systems. What else do we have? We can and should, of course, develop additional aquatic life criteria, not just for this 6-ppd quinone, but for toxicants that may be, different toxicants that may be driving the toxicity that we see for other relevant species, even if it's less overt and obvious than the toxicity we see with the Coho salmon. But we could also be letting the aquatic animals tell us whether these waters are safe. We could require toxicity testing batteries to screen for the integrated toxicity that happens with complex environmental samples instead of the one-by-one chemical approach that we currently use. So concluding thoughts on this research thread include that tires are a source of very complex chemical mixtures that end up in the air and in the water, and we're starting to recognize that some of these are definitely chemicals of concern. We are going to need both GSI and source controls, I think, to solve this problem. And finally, I want you to be thinking about the chemicals that we put into our products. This is another area where we can be making changes. So sometimes chemicals are designed to be reactive, like this 6-PPD, like the anti-ozonant. So it's really important that we start to understand better what transformation products result from those chemicals that are added in order to react on purpose with various things. So we need to be asking whether there are safer alternatives to those chemicals. And I just want to end up here with a couple calls to action. So I want to reinforce the importance of existing campaigns to reduce water and air pollution, right? Things like good vehicle maintenance. So in addition to, making sure our vehicles aren't dripping and leaking, also making sure that they have sufficient air pressure in the tires, because that will help reduce the wear on the tires, which will help reduce the amount of chemical getting into our surface waters. Obviously, the washing the car on the pavements and letting that water get into our stormwater conveyance systems, particularly cleaning those tires and making them shiny and black again. Not to be done. And finally, the idea of driving less, which includes telecommuting. And so COVID is sort of being a help with that for a lot of people anyhow. Helps us prevent the pollution that comes from our vehicles anyhow, and gets into our waterways. So we may have time for a question or we may not, but that is the end of this presentation. Thank you.
Jen, we have 1 minute left. And we have a flood of questions. So I'm going to ask if I can send you these questions and you can provide written responses that we can post on the website with the recorded presentation.
Sure thing.
Great. I want to thank you, Jennifer. This has been fabulous information, and you've given us a lot to think about, but not just what's going on and what you've discovered, but how we can take action. And I really appreciate you providing that information to us. And for the attendees, I will follow up with Jen. There are still a number of questions coming in, and with only a few seconds left, we won't be able to answer them. But thank you again, Dr. Jennifer McIntyre, and we will follow up with you.
All right. Have a good day, everybody at the conference.